Welcome to the Natural Living Development Podcast Show, where you will learn about natural building, natural living, and inspiring real estate developments from around the world. The goal of this podcast is to educate people that wish to make a difference with their investment and bring a positive change for the world. It's an opportunity to re-envision what real estate development should look like and how these developments should be funded. For more information about our natural living developments, please visit naturallivingdevelopments.com. We hope you enjoy the show. All right, welcome back. Today we have Jenny Kassan with us. She wrote the book, Raising Capital on Your Own Terms, How to Fund Your Business Without Selling Your Soul. Jenny, thank you for being with us. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. So I'm Jenny Kassan. I'm an attorney and I'm also a coach and strategy partner. And I mostly work with entrepreneurs who are trying to make the world a better place in some way. And I focus on helping them get investment funding in a way that lets them stay true to their mission and goals and values and long-term plans, and doesn't force them to be in some kind of cookie cutter approach where they're not able to really stay true to what's important to them. So I've been doing this now since 2006, and I've also raised money myself for a few different ventures. So I just love helping mission-driven ventures get the funding they need to be successful. It just drives me crazy how many amazing things are happening in the world that are very under-resourced. And I want the people that are making the big positive changes in the world to have plenty of resources to be successful.
Yeah, that's really great. And I can attest to that. I have actually read Jenny's book, and it's amazing. And it's definitely a lot of amazing information for those of us who are new to capital raising, especially small business owners like myself who had no idea this was actually possible. I went to college in economics at University of Kentucky, and never was there a class on capital raising for your business. There was classes on, starting a business plan and putting budgets together and all that stuff, but never was there an opportunity to really understand how that industry works, and that industry was actually out there. So I really appreciate you taking the time to write that book, and there was lots of amazing information and definitely life-changing for me, at least.
Thank you. I'm so glad.
Yeah. So I want to just kind of ask you a little bit. So how did you get into wanting to learn and basically share this knowledge of capital raising for small businesses, and especially businesses with a mission?
Yeah. It was pretty random that I ended up where I'm at, and I feel very lucky. So I went to law school, and I knew I really wanted to make some kind of positive difference in the world. At first I thought maybe I'll be like a civil rights attorney and be litigating cases. Then I realized I did not want to be a litigator. It didn't fit my personality, all that stress, and all that conflict. So then I started thinking about, what can lawyers do to build something positive instead of always fighting against things. And so I found out about this thing called community development, which, many people know what that is. Back then, I hadn't really heard of it, but basically it's when you go into a low income neighborhood and you work for, usually it's a nonprofit organization that's trying to make that community better by bringing affordable housing, bringing good jobs, supporting the small local businesses, making it more beautiful. And so I got really excited about that idea of community development, because that requires lawyers too, and is more about building something instead of fighting. And so I was super lucky because, after law school, it was hard to find a job doing that right out of law school, but I did get a fellowship to go get a master's degree in city planning at UC Berkeley. And that, because a lot of people who do community development have city planning degrees. And then once I was at UC Berkeley, I asked around and I said, what is the best community development nonprofit around here? And the name, the Spanish speaking Unity Council, kept coming up, which is this nonprofit that's been around since 1964. It's really incredible. It's focused in this one neighborhood in Oakland, although they do work now all over But it was back then really focused on the Fruitvale neighborhood in Oakland. And so I was lucky enough to get a job there, and I ended up staying there for 11 years doing community development, which I absolutely loved.
Wow.
And I also, one of my jobs was working with the small businesses. And so I really saw firsthand just how challenging it was for them, how under-resourced they were, even though they were such an important part of the community. Like that neighborhood is, if you've ever been there, the Fruitvale neighborhood in Oakland, it's an incredibly vibrant community with delicious food and, really unique shops. But it was just, they were working so hard and like barely making it. And I was like, what is going on? Why is it so hard to be a small business owner? Why are they so under-resourced? And then I started learning about the law of business finance. And I realized that this area of law, which is called securities law, is one of the reasons why the fact that investing in businesses is so highly regulated, which I didn't even know much about the regulations back then, but it turns out that it's so highly regulated for a business to even ask for an investment. And the world of finance, because it's so highly regulated and because it's generally dominated by people with, a lot of, with an MBA or like a PhD in economics and finance, it's very, it has become a very rarefied world that very few people have any access to or any understanding of. So finance has become this world where only like the most privileged people can really play.
Mhm.
The rest of us are kind of, just like catch as catch can. And so I was like, I want to bring the tools of finance to small business so they can be more empowered and they can access capital from supportive investors. So I ended up leaving that nonprofit after 11 years and co-founded a law firm with this securities lawyer I had met who was also really passionate about the same mission. And we worked on that together for quite a while. And then in 2015, he and I split and I went my own separate way, and I now have my own firm.
Nice.
And so, yeah, I never would have thought, like in law school, I didn't take any of the classes that had to do with business. I was like, no, I'm taking all the classes about like social justice and civil
Mhm.
rights. But in the end, I'm so glad I got into the world of business and finance because I feel like we can make such a huge difference in that world if we can try to bring some justice to that world.
Yeah, and I think that's really well said because there are so many amazing people that have brilliant ideas and have passions behind them. And, they are bootstrapping it and they're either, taking out a credit card or borrowing money from friends and family to kind of do what they need to do. But there's just the potential for growth isn't there because as we know, to be able to grow a company exponentially and to be able to help others with that, whatever their mission is for that company, they need to hire more people and they need to hire really, smart people and people that are more capable than the founder, usually.
Yeah.
That can lead that company to the next level. And to do that, you need capital because your savings, or most of the time small businesses are just making it, it's literally a paycheck to paycheck. And sometimes in the construction business
Yeah.
for us, it's like we're able to pay our bills and we're able to kind of pay our employees, but then that's it. And then
Yeah, often you don't end up getting paid yourself. Like you pay
yeah.
all your expenses, but you don't make any money yourself, which is crazy,
Right. Right. I
Yeah.
mean, you make enough to be able to pay your bills and to pay food on the table, but you're not making any profit. You're just
Exactly.
making it. So I was
And it's
really
the
excited
number
about
one
your book.
reason for business failure. Sorry, is lack of capital. So yeah, it's really when people wonder, like it's this catch-22 because people are like, oh, it's so risky to invest in small business because they have such a high rate of failure. But the reason they have such a high rate of failure is that they don't have investment. So,
Right.
they need that funding to be able to be sustainable.
Right. Like absolutely. So let's dive a little bit deep into that. So let's say that it's someone like myself who's we're in construction and we do natural building and we wanted to start to do a fundraising. So I followed your steps in the book, but why don't we just kind of take a little for the audience here? Why don't we talk a little bit about the steps that you cover in the book?
Sure. Yeah. So thinking about having worked on a lot of fundraising campaigns for businesses that have been my clients and then my own businesses, I realized there were 6 important pieces to the puzzle. and really they're steps to designing your plan. They're not even, I hate to say it, but once you finish the 6 steps, you don't have money yet, but you have a really good plan to get money.
Right.
And I really think that by creating your really well thought out, customized plan, you have a much better chance of successfully raising money instead of just starting to try to chase money wherever you might find it. So step 1 is getting clear on your goals and values. And that's where you think about, you think about how much you need to raise. You think about your long-term plans, what do you, and also your projections, like, is your business going to grow really, really fast and then maybe get sold to another company? Or is it going to grow more slow and steady and maybe take several years to even become profitable? Is it going to be cash flow positive quickly? So maybe you could borrow money, or is it going to take years before you could make any payments to investors? What are all the different pieces? Do you want to sell it quickly, or do you want to run it until you retire and then leave it to your kids? Do you want to maybe sell it to your workers someday? Like, all of the things that are important to you. Also, what about the values? What are the things that you don't want to negotiate on? Like, for example, we will only use natural building materials. No matter what our investors say, we will never compromise on that. So that's step 1. Step 2 is figuring out who your ideal investors are. And the key to that is being very creative and open-minded about who investors might be, because oftentimes when people think of investors, they're thinking a very narrow slice of the potential pool of investors. So going beyond the usual suspects. Step 3 is figuring out what you're going to offer to investors. So this is where we do start getting into some of the legal nitty-gritty, like, are you going to offer equity? Are you going to offer debt? How are investors going to get paid? Are there going to be dividends? Is there going to be interest, et cetera, et cetera? And you want to structure that so it's consistent with what you've thought about in step 1. Step 4 is your legal compliance strategy. So this is where the securities law piece comes in, because, as I said, offering an investment opportunity is highly regulated. So you need to know what the options are there and make sure you stick to something that is legal before you start talking to potential investors. Step 5 is your enrollment strategy. So that's kind of making your plan for how you're actually going to get investors to come on board and say yes. And step 6, which is something that I've discovered is so important, and it took me a while to see just how important it is, and that is preparing for obstacles that might come up along the way. And this has to do with what we call mindset issues. So what I've learned as I've done this myself and seen my clients do it, is that many times we have limiting beliefs about money, about our own worthiness, about people with money, all kinds of beliefs that we may not even be totally aware of. They might have come from our parents or family of origin or culture. And these beliefs might get in our way of successfully raising money. So kind of taking the time to look at those and preparing for dealing with them. So those are the 6 steps. So if you take the time to go through all 6 of them, and it's not necessarily like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it's like, you want to work on all of them. And then as you work on step 4, you might circle back to step 2, they're kind of this whole iterative process where it's like, if you take the time to think through all of them, you should have a good plan that is most likely to lead to success.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And to talk a little bit about the number 6 option there, preparing the mindset, I think it's kind of unfortunate, but a lot of us who are into social movements, or we're trying to make the world a better place, a lot of times we have this feeling of like, we can do this, but we have to do it as a nonprofit. We can do this, but we can't really charge people a lot. And I think everyone should live in a natural building, and everyone should have a non-toxic home and have the power to be able to feel like they're outside but living inside. But I also have to pay bills, and I also have to have a savings so I can put my kids through college. And so it's like, I had to really learn how to charge for what my worth is against my own mentality.
I feel the exact same way.
Yeah. But now, being 10 years into this movement in natural building, it's like, no, I have a lot of knowledge. I have a lot of wisdom that I've gained through this process, and learning how to build a natural building to code isn't easy. And it's, unfortunately, it's not well known yet. And I do have a value. And I feel, reading your book, I'm not sure if we named the title of your book yet, but it's Raising Capital on Your Own Terms. Um, it really was like, yeah, no, I do have a value. When I do talk to investors, I want to be able to say, yeah, this is knowledge and wisdom that I've cultivated over the last 10 years, and it's worth something. And I do feel like we're going to be able to make money for you,
Exactly. Yes, I can relate to what you're saying.
Yeah. I want to dive a little bit deep into a couple of these steps here. Obviously, the goals and value that you talked about is important, and that's kind of really individual for each company. And I think they would need, especially if they get your book, they would kind of, you really walk through them each step by step of, the answers that they need to go through. And I think it's really well done. And I think everyone that's going to be listening to this that is wanting to take their business to the next level should really get that book and follow those steps. But one of the things, obviously you can't really get too deep into it in the book, but I do have some questions in terms of some of the number 3, for example, the offer to the investors. It is, I read it, and I probably reread it several times, at least 3 times. But can you dive a little bit deeper into like the different categories that we have for offering to investors? I know there's the equity share, there's the lending, and is there any other ones that, there's
There
the.
is the third category, which we call convertible
Mhm.
instruments,
Okay.
but really those are going to fall in. Basically, it's going to be either equity or debt. And that's because, not that I don't like that. I wish we could be more creative than that, but I found out early on from my accountant that from an accounting and tax perspective, it needs to be either equity or debt. There's like no way for an accountant or tax someone who's like collecting taxes from you to wrap their head around really anything different
Mhm.
when it comes to investments. So
So why
so
don't you
that's
explain what is equity and then what is debt? So how would that work
mhm.
for a company?
Yeah. So equity is usually an ownership interest in your company. So someone owns a little piece of your company. So, you have to have some kind of an entity to offer that. So it's usually going to be a limited liability company or a corporation, could also be a cooperative. Um, there's other kinds of entities out there, but those are the basic ones. And so you're actually one of the rules around these entities is that you have the ability to break them up into little tiny pieces of like ownership interests. And so in corporations, it's called stock. In LLCs, it's often called units or membership interests. Um, and so equity is usually they own a piece of your company, and they really don't have the right to get paid back. It's kind of an investment that is a little bit more, it's putting more faith in you, in the company. And it's a little more long-term and with the hope that the company will become profitable, that the value of the company will increase. So I love equity. It's really great for someone who needs more patient capital. Whereas debt does have to be paid back. It's a debt investment when someone lends you money, there is this expectation it will be paid back. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be really onerous terms. There's all kinds of creative ways to structure debt where the investor is lending money to the business, and maybe every year the business calculates a percentage of their profits and pays that out to the investors. That's called revenue-based debt. There doesn't have to be collateral. There doesn't have to be personal guarantees. There don't have to be late payments. You can make the payment once a year. So it can be very friendly debt, but it is expected to get paid back. The lenders would have to get paid before anyone who has equity. So debt always takes priority over equity when you're kind of running low on money. And so debt is like a less risky investment, and also less designed for a really patient investment where it's going to take a while for the business to become profitable.
Right. And so in terms of equity, so that the audience can kind of understand a little bit, equity basically is a piece of the property or piece of the business, as you said. And so what would be the return? Or, I know that in your book, you talk about dividend payments, and then you talk about, as the company grows in value, the people who first come in, would get a certain percentage of equity. And then as the people later on with, once the business is more established and has less risk, there's a different value for their equity. And then in the turn, like, you were talking about venture funds where, if it gets bought out or if it gets sold, 5-10 years down the line, then the benefit of an equity owner is that you're going to benefit from that extra value that's been sold. So you're talking about in some cases people are making 10 times their money back in the Bay Area where a lot of the startups are. So why don't we go a little bit into that?
Yeah, so equity, you can get very creative with equity. With debt, it's fairly simple. Like there's the principal, which is the amount of money the investor gives you, and then there's interest, which is what gets paid on top of that. Of course, within that, there can be some creativity, but it's fairly straightforward. Like eventually they're going to get their principal back with interest on some schedule. With equity, there's all kinds of ways that investors can get paid. So there is this thing called the venture capital model, which is a lot of people, when they hear about an equity investment, this is what they think of, but it's just one way. But this model, it's good to be aware of it because a lot of people might assume, I've heard many people who are in that world of like the tech startup world, when they say equity, they're talking about this specific type of equity. And that is equity where they're going to give you some money to purchase a piece of your company, and you're going to set a valuation on the company. So they'll say, maybe, for example, like, I'm going to invest $100,000. I'm going to invest $100,000. And after that, after I give you that money, I'm going to own 10% of your company, which means that you valued your company at $900,000 because once they put in the 100, it's now valued at $1 million. So the valuation when they put their money in was 900,000. And then hopefully as quickly as possible, you're going to grow your company. You're going to be working night and day to get more and more customers. You're going to, every dime you have, you're going to invest in growth at any cost. And then hopefully there will be an exit or a liquidity event where you sell your company to another company. And they want to see that happen ideally within 5 to 7 years. And they want the value to increase by at least 10 times. So ideally, in a perfect world, you would sell your company in 5 to 7 years for at least $10 million. And then at that point, the investor would get the value of their original $100,000 would now have gone up to $1 million, and they'd be very happy because they 10x their money in 5 to 7 years or whatever it was. So that's one type of equity, but there's many other things you can do to pay investors where you don't have to sell your company and grow like a crazy rate of growth that is maybe unhealthy for a lot of company and for the world, for nature and for our planet. You can, if your company starts to become profitable, you can start to pay out dividends to investors, which is a share of the profits. There's many ways to calculate those. You can buy back equity from the investors over time or at a certain pre-agreed price or when certain milestones are hit. Also, the investor could potentially sell their equity to another investor, and that's another way they can exit. So there's all kinds of creative things you could do with equity where the investor is still going to get paid, but you don't have to sell your company for them to get paid.
And so then how would a dividend payment or one of the, I know you talked about that in the book. So can you help us explain, like, how would a dividend payment work for an equity owner?
I mean, there's so many different ways to do dividends. So for example, I have one client called Barrett Kohler Publishers, and they're actually the people that published my book. And they're a wonderful company. They've been around for a while. They're really successful. They have a pretty predictable profit every year. And so for them, what they offered was something called a target cumulative dividend. And so they set the dividend, I can't remember the number, but let's say, for example, 7%.
Mhm.
So every year the investor earns a 7% dividend. So that means that they earn 7% of the amount they invested. So like if they invested $10,000, they earn $700 a year as a dividend. So it's almost like you invested in a bank, you put your money in a bank account and you're getting 7% annual interest.
Which is like
But
unheard of for any bank at this point.
right, it's really good. So but it's cumulative. And what that means is that if they happen to have a bad year and they're not able to pay that full 7%, it's carried over to the next year. So like, let's say they had a year where they could only pay 4%, but then the next year they had a really good year. That year they'd pay 10%.
Mhm.
So that's like a really generous way to compensate investors. A lot of my clients don't do it that way because that does put some risk on the company. Obviously, if you're accumulating a lot of, if you have many years in a row where you can't pay, all of a sudden you owe a lot to your investors. So a lot of my clients will just do a target dividend that is not cumulative. So they'll say like our target every year is 7% and we'll do our best to pay that, but we may not be able to pay it.
Gotcha.
But what they do promise is that if they can't pay it, that the founders who own equity would not be able to pull out profits. So
Gotcha.
that's why it's called preferred dividend, because
Mhm.
unless the investors get their target dividend, the founders cannot pull out any profit.
Right. Yeah, and then let's go into that. And speaking of the profit, so there is, I know also you talked about profit sharing as part of the equity owners. So why don't we kind of talk about, for a company, obviously you want to be able to have some profit for your, for the next year for growth. But so how would you work something out like that for an equity owner?
Right. So it's basically the law. I mean, it's a little more complicated than this, but the law basically says that for equity investors, or really anyone who owns equity in your company, you cannot pay out dividends unless the company is profitable.
Mhm.
So let's say, you have 3 years in a row that you're losing money for 3 years, which there's nothing wrong with that. It's incredibly common. Like when you're starting a company, I mean, look at, I'm thinking like there's so
Tesla?
many. Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's so many companies that are held up as super successful. Amazon
Amazon.
lost money for like, I don't know, 15 years in a row or something. So there's nothing to be ashamed of. I have a lot of clients that freak out if they have a negative at the end of the year, but it's like, no, that's normal. You're investing in the growth of your company. But yeah, let's say you have 3 years in a row where you're not profitable. In those years, no one would get any share of the profits. Then let's say in year 4, you make a profit. You're probably not going to want to pay all the profit out to your investors, even if like the target dividend would require you to do that, because like you said, some profit is probably going to need to stay in the company because you need it for reserves. Oftentimes your profit and your cash flow are two different things. Like you might show book profits, but the cash may not be in the bank, So yeah, the very first thing you're going to want to do when you have a profit is first figure out how much of that profit is going to stay in the company to invest in things, to have reserves, to cover cash flow challenges. And then if there's anything on top of that, then you can start looking at, do we pay the investors? And let's say your investors have a target 7% dividend. So let's say you've raised $1 million. So your 7% for all of your investors added up is going to be what, $70,000. And let's say you pay out that you've put aside some money for reserves, you pay out that 70,000 to your investors, and let's say there's even still more money left after that, then at that point, depending on how your documents are written, then the owners, the founders could share in that profit, and that would be supplementing their salary. So they'd get that little extra share of profits, which is very nice.
Yeah, and then I know you mentioned also if it's an LLC, then those equity owners are also the owners. So then that profit would also be shared amongst the equity owners as well as the founders. So that's an added bonus. So you're getting your 7% dividend payment, but now you're also getting a little bonus on top of ideally if your company is growing. and it's profitable, then you're also getting part of that profit share.
Right. I mean, the hard thing with an LLC, when an LLC is taxed as a pass-through, so sometimes profit on your books can be allocated to equity holders, but they may not actually see cash. So that is something you have to kind of watch out for. They call that phantom income. But yeah, the profits in a pass-through entity like an LLC or an S corp, not all LLCs are passed through, but many of them are. It's going to be the profits are going to be passed through and have to be reported on the taxes of the equity holders.
How would you, so if the company is holding cash reserves for growth or for rainy day funds, would that still be considered the profits that has to be shown on books?
Probably, yeah. I mean, I'm not an accountant, so
Right.
I'm scared to say too much about it, but yeah, if you make a profit, let's say you make like a $10,000 profit and you're like, oh, we need that money to reinvest back into the company. If you have a pass-through organization, the owners are going to pay tax on that money, even though the money is staying in the company. So that is a little bit scary. So yeah, what most people do about that is they'll make a minimum, like a small cash distribution, just so people can cover their costs of their taxes.
Oh, that's a good idea. I didn't know that was an option. Great. All right, so I'm going to go into a little bit of the legal strategies. So we talked about, the equity and the debt. And so tell me a little bit about the legal strategy. So let's say that we wanted to do an LLC pass through. What's the process for you as a lawyer to get us what we need, or what do I need to give you?
Right. I mean, the way I usually work with clients, sometimes clients come to me having already set up an entity. And sometimes they come to me they haven't set up an entity yet. And sometimes the latter is a little bit better, because then we can start from a super clean slate. I've definitely had clients where they come to me having set something up and I have to do a lot of cleanup. But what usually happens is they'll come to me and we'll look at all their legal documents. Did they set something up already? Was it set up correctly? And then we'll talk through their big picture goals and strategy for fundraising. And so depending on, how much they want to raise, who their ideal investors are, their timeline, their values, their goals, their plans, we'll put together a plan of the best structure and what to offer to investors. So I'll give you an example. So let's say someone comes to us and it turns out that it would make a lot of sense for them to raise money from a large number of small investors. Like they have a lot of customers that absolutely love them, and they think their customers would love to become investors. And so if that's the case, they may want to do what we call regulation crowdfunding, investment crowdfunding, where you offer an investment opportunity on a regulated investment crowdfunding platform. This has only been legal since 2016. It's still fairly new under the Federal Jobs Act. But it's a great way to have, like, anyone in the country can invest. You can have hundreds of investors, but let's say you decide, I really want to offer equity because debt doesn't make sense for me right now. And a convertible instrument may not make sense, because oftentimes a convertible instrument is really designed for a situation where you're going to raise a second round later and offer equity. So we have a lot of clients that are like, we just need to raise money once. And then once we have that money, we're really going to be off to the races. We don't necessarily ever need to raise money again. So let's say you decide we want to offer equity. In that case, you may say, oh, we should not be a pass-through. We should not be an LLC that's taxed like a pass-through, because when we have hundreds and hundreds of investors investing in equity, that's going to be a hassle for our investors because they're going to everything's going to be passed through to them. If there's a profit, that's going to be passed through to them. You're going to have to get this form called a K-1, so in that case, we might say, okay, maybe we need to have you convert your LLC to a corporation, or maybe we need to change how your LLC is taxed, So what we try to do is look at the overall strategy. What is going to be most likely to allow the company to raise the amount of money they need to raise, stay true to their goals and values, reach the investors that are most likely to be the right fit for them. And then we go back and we say, okay, given all of that, do we need to change your structure and how you're taxed?
Gotcha. That makes so much sense. And I'd love to go a little bit into the regulation crowdfunding, if you don't mind. I researched, you cover so much in the book, and you cover, different strategies and different things that we can do. But I was really drawn to the regulation crowdfunding just for the nature of, at least my business, where there are a lot of people who believe in sustainability and believe that, natural building is going to be the future way of what we're going to build. But they're not like, what you would call very rich people. They're just
Exactly.
regular people that this is what they believe. And if they can, contribute $1,000 to make the company happen, they would feel ecstatic, and they,
Exactly.
yeah. So, and then most of the people that I'm thinking of are people who want to make these successful. So they care less about when they get that $1,000 back, but they care more about creating a company that's going to basically change the way we build.
Mm-hmm.
So with that being said, so crowdfunding, I know that you said we have to use a portal. So that this, can you elaborate a little bit about what that means if someone wanted to go through the crowdfunding situation?
Yeah, I mean, it's even a little more complicated than that. There's a few different options. So you don't necessarily, so there's a few different laws under which you can do investment crowdfunding. And even before that new law went into effect, we were actually doing it under different laws that are state level options. So if you happen to just want to raise money in a single state, or even a few states, like 2, 3, 4. I had one client that even did 16 different states. You might not have to go under the federal law.
Mhm.
However, in different states, it's easier. And in some states, it's just super easy. In some states, it's much harder. Like California, doing a California crowdfunding offering is pretty onerous. It's pretty challenging. Whereas like in Georgia, like if you fall under this one, like exemption they have is super easy. So that's another thing that's a possibility. But let's say you're like, no, I really want to raise from everyone in the United States.
Yeah.
Then you would use the federal option, which is called regulation crowdfunding. It's not perfect. There's some things about it that I wish were a little bit different, but you do have to go through a platform, which I advocated that not be the case, because I don't love the fact that you have to go through a platform. I feel like that's very limiting, and there's a lot of platforms out there, but a lot of them maybe aren't going to be a good fit for you, or they're not very professional, or they don't have good customer service, or the fees they charge are really high. But luckily I did co-found one called Crowdfund Main Street, which I highly recommend. But
oh, cool.
And once I found out they are going to require that, then I made sure, I was lucky enough, I should say, to meet a founder who wanted to do it in a way that I felt really good about. So anyway, so you do have to do it through a platform. Most of your communication has to be on the platform. You have to file a fairly complex set of disclosures with the Securities and Exchange Commission. And you can offer whatever you want. It's totally up to you. There's no limit from the legal side on what you can offer. So you could offer equity, debt, convertible instrument, whatever you want. You can now raise up to 5 million. One part that is a little bit challenging is you do have to have professionally prepared financial statements. And if you're raising over, I always forget this. If you're raising over, oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed. I always forget these numbers, but basically if you're raising over $1,070,000, you need audited financials. And then I think if you're raising over 107,000, you need reviewed financials. I think that's right. It's confusing because they put a special thing in place because of COVID, where if you raise now and you finish your raise before August, I think you can raise up to 250,000 without reviewed financials. But anyway, whatever, even if you're only raising 100,000, you still need professionally prepared financial statements prepared in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. And that's can be challenging. You need a professional to prepare it. So that can be an expense that you have to deal with. So there's some requirements that are a little bit onerous, but the good news is there's no review by the regulators. Once you file your documents, you can immediately start raising. They also just changed the rules recently where you can even start. It used to be that if you were going to do investment crowdfunding, you couldn't tell anyone. You had to keep it a secret until you actually filed that form and your disclosures. But now they do allow this thing called testing the waters, where you actually are allowed to tell people before you do any filing at all, hey, I'm thinking about doing crowdfunding, what would you think?
Oh, that's
So yeah,
cool.
there's a few recent changes that have made it a little bit better. They raised the limits on how much each individual investor can invest. And so, yeah, it's a good tool. It's not perfect, but it's nice.
Yeah, I'd like to go ask you a question about, so for the crowdfunding, you said a couple things that I have questions about. So one of them is the portals. If you want to use federal, it needs to be a federal regulated portal. Basically, for those listeners who don't understand what that is, it's just basically someone that went and got the license so that they can actually raise the funds. And then you said that communication has to be done through the portal. And then would a business owner, would they not be allowed to put their information on their website? It would have to go through the portal. So you couldn't put like this, if you invest with us, you get this amount return. It would all have to.
You can't do that. So it's really complicated, the rules, and it's very hard to stay compliant with them because they're very counterintuitive. But basically, you can talk about the fact that you're raising money on an investment crowdfunding platform, but you can't give any details like the amount you're raising, what you're offering, the terms of the offering, even like the timeline. You can't say like, oh, invest today because it's closing tomorrow. You're not allowed to say any of that. So what you have to limit, and then it's even more complicated because sometimes you are allowed to say that in certain types of communication. But basically on your website, you would just have like a big banner that says, hey, we're raising money, we're offering an investment opportunity, click here. And then it would take them to the crowdfunding portal where they could get all the details.
Gotcha. So you're not allowed to say how much you're raising and
is it equity? Is it debt? What
you're
is
not
the
allowed to talk about that.
return?
And what the returns are.
Timeline?
Yeah. So that all has to be done through the certified portals. Okay. Yeah. Great.
Although, like I said, there is a small exception to that, but I won't go into that. It's all in my book.
Yeah, definitely read the book for sure. Okay, and then great. So then what are you allowed to say then on your website other than, like what you said, well, we're not allowed to say? Are we allowed to present anything that would basically entice someone, or like you said, test the waters to see if there's people interested?
Yeah, I mean, what you would do is you would just talk about how great your company is. Like that is always allowed. It's when you get into the details of the investment opportunity that it gets a little more regulated. But, if people think you have an amazing company and that you tell them like, this is our mission, this is our passion, like we're planning to grow by this much next year and we've already done this, these are all things that are just about your company, not about the investment opportunity. And that it's totally legal to talk about that.
Yeah. Okay. So we're trying to work on a development, and obviously it's very similar to the business raising funds in terms of the SEC rules and regulations. And so if we do a 506c, we are allowed to talk to investors. We are allowed to share information. We can post information on our website and they can go through that. Is that also a possibility for business?
Yeah, I mean, whatever you're raising money for, if you're raising money from investors, it's basically all going to be the same. So every now and then there might be slightly different rules for real estate. Strangely enough, in California, if you're doing it under California law, they do have more onerous requirements for real estate offerings, but in most cases, like under the federal law, it's not going to make any difference whether you're raising money to develop real estate or for a startup business or whatever it is, it's all a security, it's all an investment opportunity.
Mhm.
So in fact, like there's a lot of talk these days about like what is a security, because if something is a security, it's regulated under securities law, and there isn't necessarily a lot of importance around what specifically is the security. And that's why a lot of people are talking about like, oh, our NFT is a security, and
Right.
so the good news is like whatever you're raising your money for, if it's a security, the rules are pretty much going to be the same. So and with, like you said, with 506c, that is very different from regulation crowdfunding because it's limited to just accredited investors, which is people who are wealthy that have at least $1 million in net worth, not including their primary residence, or 200,000 in annual income. And if you limit the investors to accredited investors, you can raise under 506c. And in that case, you can publicly advertise. There's really no limit on what you can say as long as you're truthful.
Right.
So 506c is great. I'm actually currently raising money under Rule 506c for a real estate project.
Oh, nice.
So,
Awesome.
yeah, it's great. But what I do hate about it is the fact that you have to exclude like approximately 90% of the population as potential investors.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate. And obviously, if you partner with a really established crowdfunding source or someone that is makes it easy for customer service, and sorry, I thought my phone was off. If it makes it easy for them to be able to, understand what they're getting into, if the crowdfunding website is really, attractive to be able to kind of do it, then I think it makes sense. But obviously, if I would imagine the 506c would be good if you're not raising a lot, but you have friends and family that are going to be able to support you. So because you under 506, you are allowed to have friends and family invest. Is that correct?
No, everyone. Well, I mean, yes, but they do all have to be accredited.
Okay, gotcha. So everyone under 506c has to be accredited. There's no loophole for non-accredited.
No, but one thing you can do, we call this like a side-by-side offering, is that you can raise under both regulation crowdfunding and 506c at the same time. So that it's a little tricky. And I did it once where in 2017, I raised money for this thing called the Force for Good Fund. We didn't do it at the same time, but what we did is we raised a bunch of money on WeFunder, which is an investment crowdfunding platform. We raised like 400,000. And then we did a 506c right after. Some people will even do it at the same time, so that if someone is unaccredited, they can come in through the regulation crowdfunding offering. And if they're accredited, they can come in through the 506c offering. Gotcha. And that's a nice way to save on fees, because if somebody comes in through 506c, that's not going to be subject to the fees of the platform.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So now I would like to get into a little bit of the cost to do all this. So let's say someone like me or a business owner wants to contact you, how much money should we have saved up so you can help us through this process? And then is there any other, you said there's also the accountant that has to look at the financials. And is there any other, and then there's the portal fees, the fees that the company, if you're going to do crowdfunding, and I'm sure there's probably different fees that you would charge for a 506c.
Right. What usually happens when someone comes to us is they may not know exactly how they want to raise money. So the very first thing we do is what we call a financing assessment to help them design their strategy. So it may be like, okay, we're going to start with a 506c and then we're going to do a Reg CF, or, oh, we're going to do a private offering under Rule 504. And then later on, we're going to, do something else. So we help them figure out the strategy. And what we often do is we'll design it in a way that allows them to start raising money quickly, because oftentimes, to be totally honest with you, they don't have enough money to pay our total fee.
Right.
Which isn't surprising, right? Like they're coming to us to help raise money and they may not have all the money in the bank that we would require to be paid to us for our legal services, our coaching services, all of the support that we provide. So that's why we do this thing called a quick start, where we try to help people get some money in the door quickly so that they have that cushion to pay for our services, to, get other support that they might need as they go on their fundraising journey.
Gotcha. Well, I really appreciate the time that you've taken with us. We've covered a lot in a short amount of time, and I'm sure we can keep on going for much longer. Maybe if you're okay, we could have you on again
Sure.
next month sometime.
Anytime.
And yeah, and then we can kind of keep sharing. I'm sure you're probably going to update your books. I know some of the stuff that was on there it's already changed.
Well, I will say that along with the book, you do get a link to a private website where we have updated information and lots of resources there. So yeah, so maybe I won't have to update it. I just will update the website.
Yeah, there you go. And it's really great for those of you who are getting the book on either Audible or in hand. I've used the website already, and there's lots of amazing information there. And so I really appreciate everything that you're doing for us small business owners. And I look forward to connecting with you in regards to our own business. And I'd love to share that with our audience as we kind of go down the path with you. And yeah, and is there any way that we can contact you? You want to share your website, your email with us?
Yeah, the easiest way to find me probably is just to go to jennykassan.com. We have lots and lots of resources there, blog posts, we have a podcast. Yeah, lots of free downloads to help you kind of get started on figuring out your goals, your values, your plans. So yeah, we love to do as much as we can to kind of help people get along the path of starting to imagine what it might be like to raise money and start to create that plan.
Great. So I'll put the website on the show notes, and they can go and check it out. So thank you, Jenny, again for your time. And I really appreciate you. And I'll look forward to talking to you soon.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Natural Living Development Podcast. We hope that you enjoyed the show. Please help spread the word by sharing this podcast with your friends on social media, leaving us a review, and subscribing to the show. For more information about our natural living developments, please visit naturallivingdevelopments.com. If you want to learn more about natural building, join our intern or apprenticeship program, or if you're interested in building a natural building for your family, please visit naturallivingschool.com. See you next show.